They were supposed to heal us. But what if the very pills we trust are born in places that would make a slaughterhouse look clean? Behind sealed factory doors and sterile labels, the truth of modern drug manufacturing has begun to rot. From India to China to the United States, the same pattern repeats. Peeling walls, leaking pipes, and workers stirring life-saving formulas beside open buckets of chemical sludge. These aren't just accidents. They're symptoms of an industry where shortcuts replace safety and contamination, hides beneath the label FDA approved. Every year, more than 4 billion prescriptions are filled in America, yet fewer than 5% of the foreign plants making them are inspected annually. So how many of those pills actually come from dirty factories we're never told about? And how many lives have already paid the hidden cost of corporate convenience? This is the Downturn Report, where the truth gets personal. Tonight, we step inside the forbidden world of pharmaceutical manufacturing, where 5 shocking factory scandals shattered public trust and forced worldwide recalls. From rusted vats to falsified lab reports, this is the untold story behind how medicine turned toxic before it ever reached your hands. Number 1. Johnson & Johnson. It didn't start with a breaking headline. It began with a smell, faint, chemical, and wrong. Mothers noticed it first, that sour, factory-like odor wafting from bottles of their children's Tylenol. Pharmacists whispered, pediatricians frowned, but Johnson & Johnson, the corporate saint of American medicine, shrugged. For decades, the name had been synonymous with trust. Bandages for the wounded, baby shampoo, as gentle as a mother's touch. Yet behind the pristine commercials and smiling lab coats, something sinister had been festering inside the company's Fort Washington plant. And when the curtain finally lifted, what the Food and Drug Administration found wasn't a manufacturing facility. It was a horror show with stainless steel props. Inside the McNeil Consumer Healthcare factory, machines were caked with residue like barnacles on a forgotten ship. Dust and grime clung to equipment that was supposed to make medicine for children. The FDA found over 20 violations, filthy equipment, falsified records, and test results that looked more like someone had played connect the dots with human health. And while these problems were multiplying, Johnson & Johnson had already received 46 consumer complaints about strange smells and sick reactions, but chose to ignore them. They didn't just miss the red flags, they folded them neatly and tucked them into a drawer. What kind of corporate conscience lets babies swallow medicine made in a plant where even the floors failed basic hygiene tests? By April 2010, McNeil was forced to voluntarily recall more than 50 children's medicines, Tylenol, Motrin, Benadryl, and others products found in nearly every American household. The FDA called it one of the largest over-the-counter recalls in U.S. history. The company called it a precaution. That's like calling a fire an unexpected warmth. The investigation exposed that McNeil hadn't acted out of caution. It had acted because it was cornered. The production process was a ticking bomb. Ingredients improperly mixed, storage areas contaminated, and chemical vapors leaking into packaging. Inspectors discovered black particles floating in liquid Tylenol, uneven doses of active ingredients, and contaminated water used for cleaning. These weren't isolated errors. They were the fingerprints of a broken system. And then, like clockwork, more recalls followed. First came November 2009's moldy odor, Tylenol arthritis pain pills that made consumers vomit. Then January's Puerto Rico plant recall. Then April's children's syrup scandal. By July, 21 more batches were yanked for the same nauseating chemical smell, traced to wooden pallets treated with a fungicide called tribromophenol. The irony? That same smell, once dismissed as minor, had already sickened people months earlier. It wasn't bad luck, it was bad leadership. Even the wood beneath their medicine was poisoned by negligence. If this had been a movie, the audience would have laughed at how obvious the villain was. Congress wasn't laughing. The U.S. House Oversight Committee called Johnson & Johnson executives to testify under oath. For a company that had once marketed itself as the moral compass of American healthcare, the optics were devastating. Senators described the scandal as a systemic failure, and the FDA began contemplating legal sanctions. Behind closed doors, company officials admitted what they had long denied publicly. The production floor had fallen apart. Maintenance was inconsistent, and quality control was more performance than procedure. And through it all, Johnson & Johnson's public statements still dripped with corporate perfume. "We're committed to the highest standards," they said, even as their own workers were sweeping mold off factory walls. By the end of 2011, the Tylenol plant in Pennsylvania was shut down permanently. J&J promised reforms and stricter oversight, but the damage was irreversible. To the average American retiree counting pills by the kitchen light, this wasn't a story about one company's mistake. It was proof that even billion-dollar brands can rot from the inside when profit replaces principle. The Fort Washington plant became a cautionary tale, a monument to how negligence, when dressed in a lab coat, can masquerade as care. And as the headlines faded, one haunting question remained in every medicine cabinet. If even Tylenol was mixed in the shadows, how many other bottles on those shelves are hiding the same dirty truth? Number 2, Maiden Pharmaceuticals. It sounded like a nightmare ripped from a bad movie. Only this one was real, and its victims were children. In late 2022, as the world still staggered from pandemic fatigue, another silent killer crept through medicine cabinets, this time wearing the label of an Indian-made cough syrup. 4 brands produced by Maiden Pharmaceuticals were found to contain ethylene glycol and diethylene glycol, industrial chemicals meant for car engines, not children's throats. The World Health Organization didn't mince words. The syrups contained unacceptable levels of toxins, hundreds of times over the safe limit. By the time the truth surfaced, at least 70 children in Gambia were dead, their kidneys destroyed by poison disguised as medicine. Imagine a mother in a rural clinic spooning syrup into her child's mouth, believing she's helping him sleep, when in reality, she's delivering death 1 teaspoon at a time. The revelation hit the global pharmaceutical industry like a thunderclap. India, once hailed as the pharmacy of the world, suddenly looked more like a rogue chemist's den. The government of Gambia ordered an emergency recall, while India hastily suspended operations at Maiden's factory. But when inspectors finally stepped inside, what they found could make any factory worker in Detroit or Ohio feel sick. Rusted tanks, chemical drums stacked like scrap, no proper air filtration, no record of batch testing, and zero traceability of ingredients. The Indian Ministry of Health itself admitted the company had violated rules across the entire manufacturing and testing process. In plain terms, every step, from mixing to bottling, was contaminated with greed. It wasn't an accident, it was a business model. The reason behind the disaster was chillingly simple. To cut costs, some manufacturers were replacing pharmaceutical-grade glycerin with cheaper industrial chemicals like ethylene glycol. Odorless, sweet-tasting, and deadly. It's the same stuff that keeps your car radiator from freezing. In a medicine bottle, it turns the syrup into poison. Children who drank it began vomiting, losing consciousness, and slipping into fatal kidney failure. The world watched in disbelief as Gambia's tragedy echoed in Uzbekistan months later. Another batch of Indian-made cough syrups, another set of small coffins, another chorus of denials. The same toxic chemicals were found in Marion Biotech's Doc-1 Max, claiming at least 18 young lives. It was as if the same script was being replayed, only the stage changed from Africa to Central Asia. And hauntingly, India itself had seen similar deaths as early as 2019, when 12 children died after consuming locally made cough syrup laced with diethylene glycol. But perhaps the most grotesque act came later. Even after global outrage and headlines screaming, "Poison children," the lessons weren't learned. By September 2025, in India's own Madhya Pradesh, another cough syrup, Coldriff, killed 24 children. Tests showed it contained nearly 50% diethylene glycol when the legal limit was 1/10 of 1%. That's not a mistake. That's murder with a receipt. Authorities arrested the owner of Shrisen Pharmaceuticals, sealed the plant, and ordered a full recall. But when journalists and inspectors entered the factory, what they saw wasn't a lab. It was a nightmare in broad daylight. The floor was coated in grime. Chemical containers were stacked beside open buckets. Rust dripped from pipes, and half-burned bottle labels were scattered in the courtyard like confetti after a disaster. The smell alone could knock you unconscious. One investigative report listed over 350 violations, rusted machinery, missing hygiene controls, no testing of ingredients, and no qualified staff overseeing production. It wasn't a pharmaceutical plant. It was an alchemist's garage masquerading as science. This was no isolated scandal. It exposed a deeper rot within parts of India's pharmaceutical sector, a system so desperate to stay cheap and competitive that it began poisoning its own legacy. For years, the world applauded India's low-cost medicine exports, blind to what lay behind the curtain: underfunded regulators, bribed inspectors, and factories where paperwork mattered more than purity. The cough syrup tragedies were just the tip of an iceberg that stretched from small-town labs to international supply chains. And when the recall orders rolled in, first Gambia, then Uzbekistan, then India itself, the rest of the world finally saw what had been hidden in plain sight. For working Americans who buy generic drugs at chain pharmacies, this story hits uncomfortably close, because those pills and syrups often travel halfway across the world before landing in your medicine cabinet. And if factories like Maiden's could fake safety in the shadow of global agencies, who's to say others aren't doing the same? The factory scandal wasn't just an Indian problem. It was a warning siren for the entire planet. When medicine turns into poison, when greed replaces care, and when oversight becomes optional, no one is safe. The syrups may have come from Haryana, but their lessons should echo in every home. Behind every cheap label, there might be a price paid in blood. Number 3, Glenmark Pharmaceuticals. It was supposed to be the pride of India's pharmaceutical export empire, a spotless, high-tech factory in Madhya Pradesh that supplied America's hospitals with FDA-standard medicine. But when ProPublica investigators stepped inside in late 2024, what they uncovered wasn't a temple of science. It was a ticking time bomb dressed up as compliance. Glenmark Pharmaceuticals, one of India's most profitable exporters, had quietly been recalling tens of millions of pills over the past year. The official reason? Improper dissolution. In layman's terms, the pills didn't dissolve the way they should inside the body. But what that actually means is far darker. Patients swallowing life-saving medications that either released too little or too much of the active drug, sometimes dumping the entire dose into their system at once. And when that drug was potassium chloride, a compound that directly affects the heart, the result wasn't just discomfort, it was death. In May 2024, Glenmark pulled back nearly 47 million potassium chloride tablets from the US market after reports surfaced of erratic disintegration rates. Some tablets barely dissolved at all, while others melted too fast, flooding patients' blood with dangerous spikes of potassium. The FDA labeled the recall severe, warning that the defective pills could trigger cardiac arrest. The headlines were grim, but they only told half the story. Behind the scenes, ProPublica had already traced a pattern. At least 7 previous recalls in just a few months: painkillers, cholesterol reducers, blood pressure drugs, all yanked for the exact same failure. Each time, Glenmark had claimed it was a one-off technical glitch. But after the 7th coincidence, even the most forgiving regulators couldn't ignore the obvious. Something was rotten inside that factory. When FDA inspectors finally returned to Madhya Pradesh, after 4 long years without a single on-site visit, they found a nightmare disguised as normal. Machines were coated with residue from previous drug batches. Cleaning schedules existed only on paper. Workers admitted that when a batch failed the dissolution test, they simply tossed out the first sample and ran a second test until they got acceptable numbers. Equipment wasn't properly decontaminated between production runs, meaning remnants of one medicine could mix into another. In other words, your blood pressure pill might have been brewed in the same unwashed tank as a narcotic. One inspector described the hygiene standards as shockingly negligent. The truth was out. Glenmark's FDA standard plant had become a chemical roulette wheel, spinning doses that could heal or kill depending on luck. And the luck ran out. By autumn, the FDA had logged at least 8 deaths linked to Glenmark's defective potassium chloride tablets, including that of a 91-year-old woman from Maine whose family sued the company for wrongful death. The drug she took was supposed to stabilize her heart. Instead, it stopped it. For decades, Glenmark's products had been trusted by American hospitals, sold under generic labels that most patients never questioned. Now those same generics were being ripped from shelves in every state. The US government called the recall one of the most serious of the year, yet Glenmark denied direct responsibility for the fatalities, blaming variations in patient sensitivity. It was corporate doublespeak at its most, grotesque, like blaming the fire on the match that failed to behave safely. ProPublica's investigation went further, exposing not just the factory's failings, but the oversight vacuum that allowed them to persist. The FDA, the watchdog Americans rely on to guard their medicine supply, hadn't set foot in the Madhya Pradesh facility in over 4 years, despite repeated red flags. Internal memos revealed that agency staff had even considered Glenmark a low-risk site. Low risk, for a factory producing 30% of Glenmark's revenue in the United States. It was a failure of vigilance as much as it was a failure of manufacturing. The watchdog had fallen asleep, and the foxes had been running the pharmacy. When the scandal broke, Glenmark issued a polished apology promising enhanced training, renewed quality protocols, and close coordination with the FDA. But for the families who had already buried their loved ones, those words sounded hollow. You can't retrain a conscience that never existed. The image of a clean, efficient, American-compliant Indian plant had been shattered. What lay behind the stainless steel doors was a portrait of systemic decay. Pressure to meet export quotas, understaffed labs, falsified reports, and a culture where profit trumped purity. To ordinary Americans, retirees refilling prescriptions, workers stretching insurance plans, it's another reminder of how fragile the illusion of safety really is. That Made for America label doesn't mean much if the pills are produced in a factory where even the air smells like chemicals and deceit. Glenmark's collapse isn't just India's shame, it's America's blind spot. Because for every bottle on a pharmacy shelf, there's a factory somewhere whose corners were cut just enough to turn healing into hazard. And as long as those factories keep hiding behind glossy audits and corporate apologies, the next dose of medicine could just as easily be a dose of danger. Number 4. Zhejiang Huahai. It started, as most industrial disasters do, with something that was supposed to save money. In July 2018, Zhejiang Huahai Pharmaceutical, a towering name in China's booming generic drug industry, announced that it had discovered a carcinogenic impurity in its blood pressure medicine ingredient, valsartan. That impurity was N-nitrosodamethylamine, or NDMA, the same chemical used to study cancer in lab rats. The company claimed it was an accident, a byproduct of a small process change made 6 years earlier, in 2012, when engineers decided to use a cheaper solvent, dimethylformamide, combined with sodium nitrite. That tiny tweak, meant to improve yield and reduce waste, had quietly been generating NDMA in trace amounts for over half a decade, undetected by regulators in China, the United States, and Europe. It wasn't until millions of pills later that the truth leaked out like a toxic secret. When the news broke, it tore through the pharmaceutical world like a siren. Regulators in 50 countries, from the United States to Germany, scrambled to recall every single drug that used Huahai's ingredient. More than 50 major companies, including Teva, Sandoz, and Ranbaxy, found themselves yanking products from shelves overnight. Pharmacies emptied. Doctors rushed to switch patients to alternative medications. The scale was staggering. Roughly 10 billion valsartan tablets were consumed worldwide every year, and now millions of them were deemed contaminated. Patients who had taken the drug daily for years were suddenly told that their medicine could be harboring a slow-acting carcinogen. The betrayal was silent but brutal. A pill meant to protect the heart now carried the ghost of cancer within it. Huahai's official statement sounded clinical, almost sterile. The company said the contamination had been detected during a self-evaluation, that NDMA was only present in trace levels, and that it had immediately halted exports to the United States. But the phrasing felt rehearsed, like a lawyer whispering over a corpse. The truth was, Huahai's trace levels weren't benign. They exceeded international safety limits by hundreds of times. And those traces had existed for 6 long years, while the company raked in profits and regulators checked boxes instead of chemical signatures. The European Medicines Agency and the US FDA began massive investigations, but it was too late for the trust that had already evaporated. Scientists warned that while no one had yet died directly from NDMA exposure, the long-term risk was undeniable. Studies showed that sustained intake could raise the odds of liver and lung cancer dramatically. For older Americans relying on valsartan to control hypertension, it felt like a cruel twist of fate. Being told the very pill keeping their blood pressure steady might be sowing the seeds of something worse. Meanwhile, Huahai's executives framed the contamination as an unintended side effect of modernization. In other words, cutting corners for efficiency had turned the world's medicine cabinet into a chemical experiment. The factory in Zhejiang became a symbol of everything wrong with the global drug supply chain. Inspections revealed that Huahai's quality control system was little more than a paper fortress, impressive on documents, but hollow inside. The plant had passed numerous audits from international clients, yet none of them detected NDMA's presence. It was a sobering reminder that the modern pharmaceutical empire runs on trust, and trust, once broken, infects everything. The general manager of Huahai appeared before cameras, promising reforms and stricter oversight, but his voice trembled under the weight of disbelief. How could this have gone unnoticed for 6 years? How could the world's watchdogs have missed a ticking time bomb hiding in plain sight? The NDMA contamination wasn't just China's problem, it was a global wake-up call. Over 90% of active pharmaceutical ingredients used in American medicine now come from factories in China and India. Yet few Americans can name the companies that literally make their medicine. The Zhejiang Huahai scandal ripped away that comforting illusion. It showed that a single overlooked process in a single factory can send carcinogens into millions of bodies across continents. And when profit is the driver, when oversight is outsourced, and when the same people who mix the drugs also approve the paperwork, safety becomes a matter of luck. Today, valsartan from Huahai has vanished from pharmacy shelves. Regulators forced replacements, and the brand's name is now a cautionary whisper in medical circles. But the lesson remains radioactive. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and in the global drug market, that link often lies thousands of miles away, behind factory doors no patient will ever see. Number 5. Emergent biosolutions. For a moment, the Bayview plant in Baltimore was supposed to represent hope, America's cutting-edge vaccine arsenal rising to meet a historic pandemic. But behind the glossy press photos and patriotic slogans, the factory walls were literally peeling. In April 2021, an FDA inspection report leaked to the press, and what it revealed was not a triumph of science, but a tragicomic disaster in bioengineering. Emergent Biosolutions, the government-backed contractor responsible for producing Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca vaccines, had turned its federally funded facility into a biological junkyard. Inspectors found paint chipping from the walls, plaster flaking onto the floor, and dust clinging to the supposed clean rooms. Workers hauled uncovered waste containers through sterile zones. Some re-entered sensitive production areas after a single shower, despite having worked 19 days handling different vaccine materials. If the Bayview plant were a kitchen, you wouldn't eat toast made there, let alone inject millions of Americans with its product. Then came the unthinkable. The vaccines themselves had been contaminated. The FDA confirmed not one, not two, but 3 separate incidents of cross-mixing between Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca vaccine materials. In essence, the same vats and surfaces used for one formula were being contaminated by remnants of another. 2 vaccines that were never meant to mingle. Instead of immediate sterilization, workers simply wiped surfaces with basic cleaning supplies and kept the lines running. The result? More than 15 million doses of Johnson & Johnson vaccine, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, had to be destroyed. Millions more were quarantined under suspicion of contamination. The FDA bluntly stated that there is no assurance any of the remaining doses were pure. It was like discovering your neighborhood bakery had been frosting cakes with the same spatula used to stir bleach. Johnson & Johnson quickly pulled its production from the Baltimore site and shifted to European plants. Emergent, meanwhile, received a series of escalating warnings before the FDA finally ordered a total shutdown in April 2021. But as later investigations would show, the scope of the failure was much worse than anyone had guessed. A congressional COVID oversight committee report revealed that Emergent ultimately had to discard the equivalent of nearly 400 million vaccine doses due to ongoing contamination, equipment failure, and expired stock. 240 million doses were trashed at the end of 2020 alone, months before the public even knew there was a problem. Another 90 million were lost during Bayview's suspension, and 60 million more expired while sitting in storage. Each vial represented not only a wasted shot, but a broken promise. The congressional findings painted a picture of chaos disguised as urgency. Mold grew on walls, sterilization systems malfunctioned, and employees repeatedly violated basic biosafety rules. Internal emails showed that company executives were fully aware of the very high risk of contamination, but chose to press forward, fearing delays might cost contracts. In other words, speed over safety, profit over precision. One email summed it up best: "We are walking a tightrope." They weren't wrong, except the tightrope was strung over the public's trust. When federal investigators confronted Emergent, the company deflected, insisting it had been transparent with the government, public, and partners. But transparency means little when the product is poisonously flawed. By late 2022, the U.S. Department of Health officially terminated its contract with Emergent and handed full oversight of the Bayview facility to Johnson & Johnson. The partnership that was supposed to symbolize public-private victory in pandemic preparedness ended as one of the most embarrassing pharmaceutical scandals in American history. No one died as a direct result, but the damage ran deeper than any body count. The incident exposed how, even in the wealthiest nation on earth, the chain of vaccine production could break under pressure. When the world's attention was focused on saving lives, basic manufacturing discipline had slipped into disarray. The Bayview fiasco became a metaphor for something larger, that the system Americans trusted to protect them could crumble from the inside, not through malice, but through neglect. And for millions who lined up for those precious shots, that truth was harder to swallow than any vaccine. The truth behind every pill deserves the light. Subscribe now and never let hidden factories decide your health again.
Thanks so much for sticking with us to the very end. If you liked this video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our daily updates. And now feel free to check out some of our latest and most popular videos showing up on your screen. Goodbye, and see you in the next one.